I never thought a broken piece of jaw could make my heart race. It wasn't even mine, of course. It was something I saw in a photograph one Saturday morning, sitting at my uncle's desk while he was fixing the radio. The picture was old and grainy, showing a chunk of brownish fossil with a row of teeth, some chipped, some smooth like pebbles worn down by time. Underneath, in faded letters, it said, Ouranopithecus macedonensis, 9 million years old. I read the name again, slowly, as if saying it twice might make it less strange. Ouranopithecus. My tongue stumbled over the syllables, and I felt like I'd just opened a door into some ancient museum no one else had noticed. "Uncle, what's this?" I asked, holding up the paper. He didn't even look. "Monkey bones," he said, waving a screwdriver. "From Greece. Found in the 70s, I think. Not sure." That should have been the end of it, but I couldn't let it go. Monkey bones from Greece? I'd seen monkeys at the zoo. They lived in warm places with bananas and palm trees, not in the hills and dry lands of Europe. And this Ouranopithecus was 9 million years old. 9 million. That's not just old. That's before humans, before the ice ages, before most of the animals I even knew about. My mind started spinning. If it was from before humans, could it be ours? I mean, not mine and yours, but part of our family tree? The thought clung to me like burrs on my socks. I decided to find out. The first thing I learned, hunched over our creaky laptop that night, was that Ouranopithecus wasn't some random monkey. It was an ape. And there's a big difference. Ape means no tail. Ape means closer to us than to any monkey swinging through the Amazon. Gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, bonobos, all apes. And, of course, humans. Which made me sit up straighter in my chair. Ouranopithecus lived in Europe around 9.6 to 8.7 million years ago, during the late Miocene epoch. The Miocene, even the name sounded like a faraway planet, was a time when the earth was warmer, forests spread wide, but grasslands were starting to creep in. Greece, back then, wasn't exactly the olive tree and blue sea postcard we know today. It had patchy forests, open woodlands, and stretches of dry grass where hoofed animals grazed. And somewhere in those landscapes, Ouranopithecus moved on knuckles or feet, through branches, or along the ground, we don't know for sure. One thing made it stand out in all the articles I read: it had a huge jaw. Not just strong, massive. And teeth that looked ready to crush hard, tough foods. Some scientists thought it ate roots, nuts, or seeds from the dry landscape. That meant it was probably spending a lot of time on the ground, foraging in the open, not just swinging from tree to tree like modern gibbons. But here's the thing that made me pause. Some scientists think Ouranopithecus could be related to the very first line of human ancestors. Others argue it's more closely tied to gorillas. And some say it might just be a distant cousin, an evolutionary branch that ended long before we arrived. I imagined it for a moment: a creature with the body of an ape, a face maybe a bit like a gorilla's but different, walking under the hot Miocene sun. Would it look at me and see something familiar? Or would it just see another strange animal in its world? I wasn't satisfied with just reading descriptions. I wanted to see it. So I did what any desperate kid would do: I searched for reconstructions. The internet didn't disappoint. One image showed a creature with deep-set eyes, a heavy brow, and a wide mouth. Its fur was short, dark, almost shiny in the sunlight of the artist's imagination. Another picture gave it lighter, reddish fur, almost orangutan-like. And in both, it had that jaw, that strong, square jaw, like it could bite through a branch if it wanted to. Looking at it, I felt this strange mix of awe and confusion. Here was something so close to us in the grand tree of life, but so far in time I couldn't even picture the earth it walked on. No buildings, no roads, no human voices. Just wind over dry grass and the occasional call of something, maybe another ape, maybe a predator. That's when I started wondering, if Ouranopithecus lived in Europe, and it's possibly linked to us, does that mean the first step toward being human happened in Europe and not Africa? Everything I'd learned before told me the human story began in Africa, the cradle of humankind. Fossils like Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, and Homo habilis had been found there. And modern genetics confirmed our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, were African apes. But here was this fossil from Greece and maybe Bulgaria, looking suspiciously like an early member of our family. Some scientists had even suggested that the ancestors of great apes and humans might have started in Europe, then moved into Africa millions of years ago. It was a wild idea, not the kind you see in school textbooks. And it wasn't just one fossil. Around the same time, other ancient apes like Grycopithecus had been found in the same region. All of them were stirring up debates among scientists about where we really came from. I decided I needed a plan. I couldn't just read random articles. I needed to follow the trail like a detective. So I drew a timeline on the back of my math notebook. At the far left, I wrote 9.6 million years ago, Ouranopithecus in Greece. Then I started filling in the big events I knew. 7 million years ago Sahelanthropus chodensis in Chad, one of the earliest known hominins. Around 4 million years ago Australopithecus in East Africa. Around 2.5 million the first Homo. There was this big gap between Ouranopithecus and the African fossils. A gap of 2 or 3 million years where we didn't really know what was happening. And in that space, all kinds of possibilities could hide. That was the first time I felt it, the sense that history isn't just something you read. It's something you piece together, like a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. That night, I lay in bed, imagining I was standing in Miocene Greece. The sun was bright, the air dry. In the distance, herds of antelope-like animals moved slowly, heads bent to the ground. A few strange creatures, ones I'd never seen in books, wandered between trees that looked more scrubby than tall. And then I saw it, an Ouranopithecus, crouched near a bush, using its strong hands to break open something, maybe a nut, maybe a hard fruit. Its mouth moved slowly, chewing with that heavy jaw. Its eyes lifted, catching sight of me. Not fear, not aggression, just a long, thoughtful stare, as if it knew something I didn't. Then, like a movie fading out, the scene blurred and disappeared, leaving only the hum of the fan in my room. In the days that followed, I read about the excavation in Macedonia, Greece, where the first Ouranopithecus fossils were found. I learned about the paleontologists who carefully brushed dirt away from bones that hadn't seen sunlight in millions of years. I learned how they compared teeth and jaws with other fossils, looking for patterns in shape and size. The more I read, the more I realized something important: science isn't about having all the answers. It's about questions. Ouranopithecus raised a big one. Could this be where our story began? No one could say for sure. Maybe it was an ancestor. Maybe just a cousin. But either way, it was part of a world that shaped the path leading to us. And for me, a kid sitting in a small room with an old laptop, that was enough to make me feel connected to something impossibly big. I think that was the exact moment I decided I wasn't just going to read about this. I was going to follow it, every fossil, every theory, every debate. Because somewhere, buried in dust and stone, was the answer to the question that had started it all: was Ouranopithecus the first chapter in the human story? I didn't know it yet, but finding that answer would take me far beyond Greece into Africa, Asia, and into the minds of scientists who'd been chasing this mystery for decades. But for now, all I had was a jawbone in a photograph, and the feeling that I'd just opened the first page of a book I couldn't put down. It's strange how quickly you can forget the world you actually live in when you start imagining the one that came before. My friends at school were talking about football, and I was thinking about the Miocene. 9 million years ago, the Earth wasn't completely alien, but it wasn't home, either. The continents were roughly where they are now, but the air felt heavier, warmer. Ice caps were smaller, seas were higher. If you looked out over a Miocene horizon, you wouldn't see any buildings or power lines, just long stretches of forest, grassland, and scrub, broken by rivers and dusty hills. The Miocene wasn't quiet, though. It had its own noise: the deep calls of giant proboscideans, elephant relatives, the flutter of prehistoric birds, the rustle of hoofed animals moving through the grass. And somewhere in that soundscape, in what's now northern Greece, an ape called Ouranopithecus was chewing something tough under the shade of a tree. When I first tried to picture it, I kept slipping into the wrong images. My brain would give me chimpanzees in a rainforest, or gorillas in lush jungles. But Greece during the late Miocene wasn't like that. I found an old paleo environment map online. The colors showed what kind of habitats existed. Big patches of yellow for dry grassland, green for scattered woodland, and only small bits of darker green for denser forest. It was drier, more open, which probably meant Ouranopithecus had to adapt to a tougher menu: hard fruits, nuts, maybe underground tubers. The jaws made sense now. If you've got to crack hard shells or grind fibrous plants all day, you'd better have the dental equipment for it. And Ouranopithecus clearly did. One evening, I sat cross-legged on the floor with my math notebook again. I drew two rough columns: Europe on one side, Africa on the other. On the Europe side, I wrote, Ouranopithecus macedonensis, Greece, 9 to 8.7 million years ago. Gricopithecus freibergi, Greece/Bulgaria, maybe 7.2 million years ago. On the Africa side, Sahelanthropus chodensis, Chad, about 7 million years ago. Ouranopithecus, Kenya, about 6 million years ago. Looking at it, the two lists felt like puzzle pieces that might fit together, or maybe not at all. Some scientists argued that the great ape family, gorillas, chimps, humans, could have started in Europe, then moved to Africa before those African fossils appeared. Others said no, Ouranopithecus and its kind were just dead-end European apes, not on the direct human line. The problem was, fossils are stingy with their secrets. The jaw of Ouranopithecus doesn't tell you everything: how it moved, how social it was, whether it walked on two legs sometimes. Those details are the ones that could tip the scales toward human ancestor or cousin. The next day, I asked my science teacher, Mr. Javed, about it. He scratched his chin and said, "Science changes when new fossils are found." If you asked in the 1980s, people would say the story starts only in Africa. But now, there are hints of something more complicated. Then he leaned closer. But remember, complicated doesn't mean certain. You can't move the cradle of humankind just because of one or two fossils. You need a lot more than that. I nodded, but inside I thought, what if one or two fossils are all we get? What if most of the others never survived? That was the frustrating thing about the deep past: it doesn't care about your curiosity. The Miocene world had no reason to preserve a neat line of ancestors for us to find. Most creatures that lived back then left no trace at all. That night, I went back to the reconstruction drawings. I found one of Ouranopithecus standing on the ground, knuckle-walking like a gorilla. Another showed it sitting upright, using its hands to crack something open. I couldn't tell which one was right. And maybe that was the point, both could be. Fossils don't capture motion. You have to imagine it, but you also have to imagine within reason. I started reading about other Miocene apes for comparison. Dryopithecus, found in Spain and France, slightly earlier than Ouranopithecus, thought to be more tree-dwelling. SavageTouch, in South Asia, with a face similar to modern orangutans. Ouranopithecus, from Turkey, also possibly related to great apes. It felt like a web, not a straight line, apes branching out, some thriving, some disappearing, some maybe giving rise to others. Ouranopithecus was part of that web. Whether it was on our branch was the mystery. I tried explaining all this to my friend Ali during lunch. "So you're saying we might be Greek?" he laughed. "Not exactly," I said, poking at my sandwich. "More like, one of our great-great-great-great-grandapes might have been Greek." "That's weird," he said. "It's not weird," I replied. "It's history. Just really, really old history." He shrugged. "Still sounds like you're making it up." That stuck with me, not because I thought he was right, but because I realized most people don't think about what happened millions of years ago. It's invisible in daily life. You don't see it when you're waiting for the bus or doing homework. But it's there, under the ground, in the bones of the earth. One article I read mentioned that Ouranopithecus fossils had been found alongside remains of giraffes, antelopes, and even ancient relatives of today's elephants. That meant they shared their world with big herbivores and probably big predators too, maybe large cats or hyenas of the time. It made me wonder how Ouranopithecus stayed safe. Living partly on the ground would make you more vulnerable, but maybe they traveled in groups, watching out for each other. Modern gorillas and chimpanzees rely on group strength. Maybe Ouranopithecus did too. Another detail caught my attention: the sexual dimorphism. Fossils suggested that male Ouranopithecus were much bigger than females, which often means a more competitive social structure. Maybe males fought for mates, like in gorillas. Suddenly, it wasn't just a fossil in my mind anymore. It was a living thing with behaviors, choices, and dangers. One Saturday afternoon, I sat outside, sketching my own version of an Ouranopithecus. Not perfectly, of course, I'm no artist, but enough to feel like I was giving it a place in the present. I gave it dark, close fur, a broad chest, and that heavy jaw. In the background, I drew dry grass, scattered trees, and a dusty sky. As I looked at it, I realized I'd made its eyes a little too human, rounder, more expressive. Maybe that was just my brain trying to pull it closer to me, to claim it as ours. But whether or not it was truly our ancestor, it was part of the world that shaped us. The Miocene wasn't just a random chapter in Earth's history, it was the time when many of the features we recognize in great apes and humans began to form. And if Ouranopithecus had walked a slightly different path, or if its descendants had moved south into Africa, then maybe, just maybe, part of its story lived on in us. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was slowly being pulled into the debate, the quiet tug of war between those who saw Europe as the possible birthplace of our lineage and those who kept Africa as the unquestioned origin. The fossils wouldn't choose sides. The scientists might argue for decades. But I had already chosen my role, not to pick a side yet, but to keep following the trail, bone by bone, clue by clue. And somewhere deep down, I knew the trail wasn't going to stay in Greece forever. It was going to lead me across seas, through deserts, into caves and riverbeds. Because the story of where we come from, no matter where it began, was far too big to fit in one country, or even one continent. I didn't expect the air to feel so dry. When I stepped out of the little bus in northern Greece, the first thing I noticed was the wind warm, carrying the scent of dust and something faintly sweet, maybe wild herbs growing somewhere nearby. The sky was a wide, endless blue. This was Macedonia, not the ancient kingdom of kings and battles, but the quieter, rural Macedonia of the present day. Rolling hills, scattered farms, winding roads. And somewhere among these hills, in a place called Ravin de la Pluie, the first Ouranopithecus fossils had been found. It didn't look like a place where history that old could hide. But that's the trick with the past, it doesn't announce itself. It sits under your feet, waiting for someone to notice. I'd convinced my uncle to come with me. He didn't share my obsession with prehistoric apes, but he liked the idea of a short trip out of the city. We followed a narrow dirt path toward a shallow valley, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the summer heat. A small sign, almost hidden in the tall grass, read, Ouranopithecus macedonensis, fossil site. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, imagining what it would have been like before anyone knew what was buried here. It was in the 1970s when paleontologists first arrived, digging carefully through layers of sediment. They were looking for clues from the late Miocene, and what they found, bits of jaws, teeth, and bones, told them they had discovered something remarkable. That's when the name Ouranopithecus macedonensis was born, the ape from heaven of Macedonia. The heaven part came from the Greek word ouranos, meaning sky or heaven. I thought it was funny not because the ape was heavenly, but because the name made it sound like it had dropped from the clouds instead of being dug from the earth. Standing there, I tried to picture the scene 9 million years ago. The valley would have been different, less farmland, more open woodland. Patches of grass where herds of grazing animals moved. A few streams cutting through the earth. And somewhere, an Ouranopithecus moving through the brush, scanning for food, listening for danger. I crouched and picked up a small stone, just to feel the weight of something from this place. It wasn't a fossil, of course, but even the soil here felt like it belonged to another time. My uncle, wiping sweat from his forehead, said, "You sure it's worth coming all the way for a few monkey bones?" "Ape bones," I corrected. "And yeah, it's worth it?" He chuckled, shaking his head. There was a small museum nearby, more like a single room in an old building where they kept replicas of the fossils found here. Inside, the air was cooler, and the glass cases held fragments that had changed how some scientists thought about human origins. The jawbones were the most impressive. Thick, heavy, with teeth worn flat in some places, sharp in others. I pressed my nose almost to the glass, imagining the muscles that would have been attached to that bone, the power in every bite. A laminated sheet explained that the teeth suggested a diet of tough vegetation and hard fruits. The large size of male jaws compared to females hinted at strong sexual dimorphism, like in gorillas today. I noticed another detail: the molars were big, but the canines, the pointed teeth, were large too, especially in males. That could mean they were used not just for eating, but for display or even fighting. It made me imagine male Ouranopithecus squaring off, showing their teeth to warn rivals away. After the museum, we walked back into the hills. There were no active digs now, the site had been studied and left quiet, but I could still see patches of exposed earth where fossils had been taken out decades ago. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the baked ground. Somewhere under here, more bones might still be sleeping. Maybe an arm bone. Maybe a skull. Maybe something that could finally tip the debate one way or the other, Africa or Europe. The thought made me shiver, even in the heat. Because it meant that the answer to where we come from might still be buried here, waiting for the right hands to find it. That evening, back in our small guest house, I pulled out my notebook. I drew the hills I'd seen, then sketched an Ouranopithecus moving through them. I gave it a wary look, as if it sensed something, maybe the presence of a predator, or maybe the strange feeling of being watched across 9 million years. I thought about how this land had changed since then. Rivers had shifted, forests had shrunk, people had built villages and roads. But the bones stayed. Silent, patient, until someone uncovered them. It made me realize that paleontology wasn't just about digging, it was about reading the land, learning its language, and knowing where the past might still be hiding. Before leaving the next day, I sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley. The wind was gentler in the morning, and the light was softer, turning the grass a pale gold. I closed my eyes and let my imagination take over. I heard rustling, not from the grass of today, but from taller, drier stalks. The call of a bird I couldn't name. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. When I opened my eyes in the vision, an Ouranopithecus was there. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to see the texture of its fur, the way its jaw moved as it chewed. Its eyes met mine, and I felt that same thoughtful stare I'd imagined before. In my mind, it turned and walked toward a cluster of low trees, vanishing into the heat haze. When I blinked, it was gone, replaced by the quiet hills and the hum of insects. But the feeling stayed, as if I'd just shaken hands with someone from the very beginning of our story. On the bus ride back, my uncle dozed off. I stared out the window, thinking about how strange it was that a place so ordinary now could have been home to something so extraordinary back then. And I knew this was only one stop on the journey. If I wanted to understand Ouranopithecus and the bigger question of where we came from, I'd have to look beyond Greece. The trail would lead to Africa, to other fossils, to other landscapes shaped by time. But I also knew I'd carry this place with me. The dry wind, the golden hills, and the silent earth where a 9-million-year-old ape once walked. Because history isn't just in books or museums. Sometimes, it's right under your feet. When the plane's wheels touched down in Nairobi, the first thing I noticed was the light. It was sharper here, almost electric, and the air smelled faintly of warm earth and something green, grass or maybe acacia trees. I'd left behind the quiet hills of Macedonia for the wide, open landscapes of East Africa, the place so many scientists called the cradle of humankind. If Greece was the chapter I'd just read, Africa was the rest of the book. At least, that's how the textbooks made it sound. I'd been dreaming of this trip since I first saw the photo of the Ouranopithecus jaw. Now, I was standing in the land where some of the oldest known human ancestors had been found: Sahelanthropus jotensis, Ororantogennensis, Australopithecus afarensis. But I wasn't here to simply nod along with what I'd already been taught. I wanted to see if the African story really left no room for my Greek ape. The first stop was the National Museum of Kenya in Nairobi. Inside, in the Human Origins Gallery, the air was cool and still. Behind glass, there were casts and real fossils from across Africa. I found myself standing in front of a small, dark skull, the famous Sahelanthropus jotensis, nicknamed Tume. It was about 7 million years old, from Chad in Central Africa. The plaque said scientists thought Tume might have walked upright at least part of the time, based on the position of its foramen magnum, the hole where the spine connects to the skull. That detail made my mind race. If it was already close to walking on two legs, then maybe it was closer to us than Ouranopithecus, which nobody could yet prove had walked upright. But 7 million years ago, that's only about 2 million years after Ouranopithecus. Could they have been connected? Could a population from Europe have made its way into Africa and become Tume? Or was Tume the descendant of an ape that had always been African? A museum guide named Wanjiru must have noticed me staring too long. She walked over and asked, "First time seeing Tume?" "Yeah," I said. "I've been reading about an ape from Greece, Ouranopithecus. I'm trying to figure out if it could be, related." She smiled, as if she'd heard this before. "Ah, the European connection. It's possible. Some researchers think apes could have moved between continents back then. The Mediterranean wasn't always a barrier, sometimes it was more like a land bridge. But," she added, holding up a finger, "possible is not the same as proven." That word stuck with me again. Possible. It was both a door and a wall. A few days later, I took a bus northwest into the Tijan Hills, the place where Ouran tijanensis was discovered. Ouran, about 6 million years old, had thigh bones that suggested it could walk upright, at least some of the time. The hills were steep and covered in patches of green. The sun was hot but softened by the wind. A local guide led me along a dirt track, pointing out where layers of sediment had been exposed by erosion. Somewhere in these layers, the bones of Ouran had slept for millions of years before being found. Ouranopithecus, with its heavy jaws and unknown walking style, felt far away here. Ouran's bones whispered something different, a body slowly adapting to life on two legs, a shift that would eventually define us. Could that shift have started in Europe? Or was it born here, in the rolling hills and dry forests of Africa? I couldn't say. But being here, I felt the weight of the African claim to our origins. The fossils weren't just old bones, they were like anchors, holding the story in place. That night, in a small guest house, I drew two timelines again in my notebook. On one side, Europe, Ouranopithecus, 9 to 8.7 million years ago, Grycopithecus, 7.2 million years ago. On the other side, Africa, Sahelanthropus, 7 million years ago, Ouran, 6 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis, 3.9 to 3 million years ago. I stared at the two lines. The gap between Ouranopithecus and Sahelanthropus wasn't impossible to cross. It was just wide enough to hold mysteries, migrations, extinctions, new species. But without fossils from that in-between time, it was like guessing a story's ending without reading the middle chapters. The next day, I traveled further west to visit the Turkana Basin, where Richard Leakey's team had found some of the most famous hominin fossils in history. The land here was open and flat, the horizon stretching endlessly. The lake shimmered in the heat. In the fossil lab, I saw casts of Australopithecus skulls, their faces flatter than an ape's but not yet human. These were much younger than Ouranopithecus, only a few million years old, but they were clearly on the human branch. Looking at them, I felt something strange. They were closer to me than to Ouranopithecus. They belonged to the Africa side of the tree, and they carried the unmistakable signs of walking upright full time. It was as if the human story here was shouting, "This is where we came from," while the Greek hills I'd just left behind whispered, "But don't forget me." On the last evening in Kenya, I sat outside, watching the sun dip behind the acacias. The air cooled quickly, and the calls of distant birds echoed across the open land. I thought about how easy it would be to choose a side, to say Africa is the cradle and leave it at that, or to insist that Ouranopithecus was the real starting point. But the truth, I was starting to realize, wasn't about picking sides at all. It was about connection. About the way species and landscapes were linked across continents by migrations, climate shifts, and survival. About how the Mediterranean wasn't just a sea, sometimes it was a bridge. About how an ape in Greece and one in Africa could both be part of the same long, winding story. When I boarded the plane back, I knew I hadn't answered the question I'd started with. But maybe that was okay. The answer might still be buried somewhere in Greece, in Africa, maybe even somewhere in between. And until someone found it, the debate would go on. Europe versus Africa. Greece versus the Rift Valley. But for me, it wasn't a fight anymore. It was a mystery with two halves, waiting to be joined. When I got back home, my head felt like it was holding two different maps. One was the familiar one, the African story of human origins, printed in textbooks, taught in classrooms. The other was new, a faint, stubborn trail beginning in Greece, winding south, and vanishing somewhere in prehistory. I couldn't just keep these maps in my head. I needed to talk to people who lived inside these questions. My first chance came when I emailed Dr. Eleni Papadopoulou, a paleoanthropologist in Thessaloniki. She'd worked on the Ouranopithecus site years ago, and to my surprise, she replied almost immediately. Her office was small, lined with shelves of fossil casts and thick books. Sunlight spilled across her desk, where a half-cleaned jawbone lay wrapped in soft cloth. "So," she said, looking at me over her glasses, "you want to know if Ouranopithecus was the first human ancestor?" "Yes," I admitted. "But, also why it's such a big argument?" She smiled faintly. "Because science is made of people, and people have loyalties. For more than a century, Africa has been the center of our origin story. To move that center, you need overwhelming evidence. And Ouranopithecus, for all its intrigue, is not overwhelming. Not yet." She pulled a file from a drawer and slid it toward me. Inside were photographs, molars, jaw fragments, detailed measurements written in neat columns. "You see this," she said, pointing to the broad molars, "and you can imagine a lineage that adapts to tougher diets in open landscapes. That's a step towards some traits we see in later hominins. But these," she tapped the measurements, "are not proof of a direct link. They are hints. Science cannot run on hints alone." "But if there were more fossils," I began. "Exactly," she said, cutting me off. "If we find a skull, a pelvis, something that tells us how it moved, then the conversation changes." A week later, I was in a video call with Dr. Mark Richardson, a researcher at an African field site. He had the sunburned face of someone who spent his days outside and the excited tone of someone who loved chasing ancient bones. "Ouranopithecus," he said when I brought it up. "Sure, I know it. Big jaw, Europe, late Miocene. Interesting animal. But if you're asking me if it's on our direct line, I'd say no." "Why not?" "Because everything we know about early hominins, their adaptations, their distribution, fits with an African origin. The climate shifts, the environment changes, the fossil sequence, it's all there in Africa. You don't need Europe to explain it." "But what if there were migrations?" I asked. "What if they came from Europe before that sequence began?" "That's a lot of what ifs," he said, shaking his head. "Science is hard enough with what we do know. If you build too much on possibilities, you risk chasing shadows." It struck me that both Dr. Papadopoulou and Dr. Richardson were saying almost the same thing, not that Ouranopithecus couldn't be important, but that the evidence wasn't enough. The difference was, one seemed willing to imagine it might be, the other thought the imagining was a distraction. The more I listened to people on both sides, the more I realized that this wasn't just about bones. It was about the weight of history, not ancient history, but the history of science itself. For decades, Africa had been the unshakable stage on which our origin story was performed. And for good reason. The fossils there were undeniable. Suggesting a European starting point felt, to some, like rewriting the play entirely. One afternoon, I attended a small academic seminar over Zoom. The topic was late Miocene hominids, new discoveries and interpretations. The faces on my screen were from all over the world: Greece, Kenya, France, the US. A researcher from Bulgaria presented findings on Ouranopithecus, another late Miocene ape from the Balkans. She argued that its dental roots showed human-like features, suggesting it could be the earliest known hominin. Almost immediately, the chat lit up with polite but pointed questions. Could those dental traits be the result of diet, not ancestry? Was the dating method solid? How do you reconcile this with the African fossil record? I watched the back and forth unfold like a tennis match. Each point countered by another, each claim met with a cautious but. When the session ended, my notebook was full of arrows, question marks, and underlined words. I wasn't sure if I was any closer to the truth, but I was definitely closer to the argument. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at my two maps again. The Africa map was heavy with evidence: skulls, pelvises, footprints hardened in volcanic ash. The Europe map had fewer marks, but they glowed in my mind because they were mysterious, unfinished. I realized I didn't want to choose between them. I wanted to find the missing path that connected them. But missing paths are dangerous territory in science. They're where imagination can outpace evidence, where you can start building castles in the air. The trick, I thought, was to build only on rock. And right now, the rock was still buried in the ground. When I told Dr. Papadopoulou about the seminar, she nodded. "This is how science works," she said. "It's not about everyone agreeing. It's about testing ideas until only the strongest survive. Ouranopithecus might survive. Or it might not. But either way, the debate will push us to look in places we might have ignored before." That gave me a kind of strange comfort. Maybe the value of Ouranopithecus wasn't just in what it was, but in what it made people do: dig in new places, question old assumptions, chase new evidence. Weeks later, I came across an old quote in a library book, from the paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey: "The only thing we can be sure of about the past is that it is going to surprise us." I wrote it at the top of my notebook, above my two maps. Because whether the surprise came from a Greek hillside or an African valley, I wanted to be ready for it. If you're ready, I can move into part 6 next. This is where the narrator follows the trail into the in-between zone, Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean, imagining the possible migration routes between Europe and Africa in the late Miocene, and how climate shifts could have shaped the journey. That's where the story starts to blend geography and deep time into one picture. I used to think the map of the world was fixed, like the one in my school atlas. But when I started looking into the late Miocene, I realized the Earth was a shifting puzzle: seas swelling and shrinking, mountains rising, rivers changing course. Borders drawn not by people, but by the slow hand of time. Somewhere in that changing world lay the mystery of how an ape from Greece could have anything to do with humans in Africa. I started with the obvious question: if Ouranopithecus really was part of our family tree, how could its descendants have gotten from Europe to Africa? Today, the answer seems simple: they'd cross the Mediterranean Sea. But 9 million years ago, the Mediterranean wasn't always the deep blue divide it is now. It was younger, messy, sometimes bigger, sometimes almost gone. In my research, I kept stumbling across one event that sounded almost mythical, the Messinian salinity crisis. About 5.9 million years ago, the Mediterranean nearly dried up, leaving vast salt flats and narrow channels instead of open water. But Ouranopithecus lived before that, during a time when the connections between Europe, Asia, and Africa were still tricky but possible, especially through the eastern Mediterranean. That's how I found myself staring at a satellite image of the Aegean Sea on my computer screen. All those scattered islands, Crete, Rhodes, Cyprus, were like breadcrumbs across the water. I imagined them not as they are now, but as the tops of ridges and hills in a more connected landscape. To the east lay Anatolia, the great bridge of land that today is Turkey. And beyond that, a patchwork of coastlines and river valleys that could, in certain conditions, lead all the way down to the Levant and into Africa. It wasn't a straight road, more like a shifting corridor, sometimes open, sometimes closed, depending on sea levels and climate. Climate, I learned, was the real gatekeeper. The late Miocene was a time of cooling and drying. Forests shrank, grasslands spread, and animals had to adapt or disappear. In Greece, fossil pollen and plant remains told of mixed landscapes, patches of woodland alongside open scrub and savanna-like grass. Ouranopithecus's big teeth might have been perfect for chewing tough, fibrous foods in such environments. But as conditions kept changing, food sources would shift. Populations could be forced to move, following the green belt south toward wetter, more stable regions. If you were an ape in Greece back then, the south wasn't just a direction, it was survival. I couldn't stop picturing it. A small group of Ouranopithecus parents, young ones clinging to their fur, moving slowly across rocky ridges, the sea glinting in the distance. They'd pause at waterholes, forage for roots and berries, skirt around herds of antelope-like creatures and the shadow of a stalking cat. When they reached the coastline, they might find narrow straits instead of wide seas. Or maybe low-lying land bridges exposed during cooler, drier periods. They'd cross without knowing they were stepping into a new continent's story. Of course, this was all imagination. But it wasn't pure fantasy. Fossils of other mammals from that era show similar patterns, species appearing in both Europe and Africa, suggesting movement in both directions. Take the proboscideans, the relatives of elephants. They left their bones like breadcrumbs across continents. If large animals could make the journey, so could smaller primates, given the right timing. The more I read, the more I realized that migration wasn't a single heroic march. It was a slow, generations-long drift. Groups would expand into new territories when food and water allowed, then retreat or vanish when conditions turned harsh. Over millions of years, these expansions and retreats could redraw the very map of life. One night, I tried tracing a possible route for Ouranopithecus on a piece of tracing paper laid over my atlas. From northern Greece, the path ran east to Anatolia, then curved south along ancient river valleys toward what's now Syria. From there, it could slip into Africa through the Sinai Peninsula, a narrow bridge of land connecting to Egypt. It was like threading a needle across time. And the thread was fragile. One shift in climate, one rise in sea level, and the corridor could vanish for centuries. But here's the catch: there's no direct fossil evidence showing Ouranopithecus, or its descendants, in these in-between zones. Not yet. That's the hole in the story, the missing middle chapters. Paleoanthropologists call it a ghost lineage when you suspect a species existed in a certain place and time, but you don't have the fossils to prove it. The ghost lingers in the gaps, tempting you with what might be. And sometimes, those ghosts are found. A single tooth, a fragment of jaw, a piece of limb bone enough to prove that a population once passed through. Other times, the ghost stays invisible, and you're left wondering if it was ever real. When I asked Dr. Papadopoulou about this missing middle, she sighed. "It's the hardest part," she said. "We know there must have been movement, because we see its results in other animals. But until someone finds a primate fossil in those connecting regions, the argument for Ouranopithecus will always be incomplete." She paused, then smiled faintly. "But the Earth is big. We haven't looked everywhere." That thought stuck with me. The Earth is big. Somewhere under layers of rock in Anatolia or the Levant, there might be a jawbone that could tip the scales in this debate. Maybe it's already been found but lies in a museum drawer, mislabeled. Maybe it's still waiting under a hillside no one has dug yet. I started keeping a little list in my notebook, places I'd want to search if I were a paleontologist. Riverbeds exposed by erosion. Old limestone caves. Dry lake beds. Anywhere the late Miocene might still whisper through stone. But there was something else I realized during this part of the journey. The question of whether Ouranopithecus was our ancestor isn't just about Europe versus Africa. It's about connection. The continents weren't isolated worlds, they were part of a bigger, shifting stage where life could cross, mix, and change. And maybe the real story isn't about finding the first human ancestor in one place or another, but about understanding the network of places that shaped us. In that sense, the land between Europe and Africa isn't just a corridor for apes. It's a reminder that the past was a web, not a straight line. By the time I put my maps away that night, the corridor between Greece and Africa felt less like a mystery and more like an invitation. Somewhere in that web of ancient rivers, coastlines, and ridges, the bones of the past are still waiting. And if we can find them, maybe we can finally see how the two maps in my head, the African one and the European one, fit together into a single, astonishing picture. When I first started reading about Ouranopithecus, it felt like the story was about ancient bones in the ground. But somewhere along the way, I realized it's really about the people who go looking for them. And they're not all the same kind of people. Some are professors with stacks of published papers. Some are students carrying shovels and field notebooks. Some are museum curators who spend more time under fluorescent lights than in the sun. They're all chasing the same thing: proof. Dr. Papadopoulou had mentioned that a dig was happening in a dry valley in northern Greece, not far from where some of the earliest Ouranopithecus fossils had been found. She offered to introduce me to the team if I could get there. So one hot afternoon, my parents dropped me off at the edge of a dusty track lined with olive trees. I walked until I heard voices and saw a small camp of canvas tents, folding tables, and sifting screens. The first person I met was Andreas, a graduate student with sunburned cheeks and a shirt stained with red dust. "You here to see the apes?" he asked, grinning. They were working on the side of a low hill, peeling away layers of sediment with trowels and brushes. I had imagined digging for fossils was like digging up treasure, big bones waiting just beneath the surface. But here, it was slow, careful work, more like surgery than excavation. Andreas knelt over a shallow pit and showed me what looked like a crumb of stone the size of my fingernail. "This could be part of a molar," he said. "Or it could just be a rock. You learn to tell the difference by looking very closely." He put it in a small paper packet, labeled it, and set it aside. Every scrap was recorded. Every layer measured. If they found something, they had to know exactly where and how it lay. In the shade of one of the tents, I met Professor Corellis, the dig leader. He'd been studying Miocene primates for nearly 30 years. "Ouranopithecus," he said, pronouncing the name like a song, is the ghost I've been chasing since I was your age. I asked him why he cared so much about one extinct ape. It's not just about the ape, he replied. It's about the story it tells, a story about how we became human. If Ouranopithecus is part of that story, then Europe had a role we barely acknowledged. If it's not, then understanding why it isn't is just as important. That night, the team gathered around a long table under a bare light bulb, eating bread and cheese and drinking water from dented bottles. They told me about the good days when a tooth appears in the silt and the whole camp hums with excitement, and the bad days, when weeks pass without a single significant find. One student, Eleni, said she'd once spent an entire summer digging and found nothing. But, she added, the summer after that, I found a jaw. You just never know. It struck me that their work wasn't just science. It was patience. The kind of patience most people never have to practice. The next morning, I followed Andreas as he worked. Hours passed, and we found nothing. My back hurt from crouching. My fingers felt dusty and raw. Imagine doing this every day for 2 months, Andreas said. And what if you don't find anything? I asked. Then you start again next year, he said with a shrug. I thought about that. It was so different from schoolwork, where you do something and get a grade right away. Here, the reward could be years away or never come at all. At lunch, Professor Corellis told me about the people who'd inspired him when he was younger. One was a French paleontologist who had spent 15 years searching in Pakistan before finding a crucial hominid fossil. Another was a Kenyan researcher who had returned to the same valley for decades, slowly uncovering layer after layer of early human history. They weren't looking for fame, Corellis said. They were looking for truth. And truth is slow. In the afternoon, something happened. Eleni was scraping at a layer of sediment when she stopped, leaned closer, and called for Corellis. We all crowded around as he examined a small, dark object embedded in the rock. Molar, he said, his voice calm but his eyes bright. Definitely primate. It wasn't enough to confirm if it was Ouranopithecus, but in that moment, the whole camp came alive. People whispered, laughed quietly, moved faster. It was like someone had lit a fire under the day. I realized then how much this work was powered by moments like that, tiny sparks in the long dark of waiting. That night, I sat outside my tent looking at the hills. They seemed so ordinary in the moonlight. You'd never guess they were full of bones millions of years old. And I thought about how strange it was that this whole debate whether Ouranopithecus was our ancestor might depend on one more discovery, one more piece of a jaw, one more tooth. And that the only way to get it was for people like this to keep coming back, year after year, with shovels and patience. Before I left the next morning, Corellis gave me a small, smooth pebble. Not a fossil, he said, but from the same layer. A reminder that the past is under our feet and that we only see it if we look carefully. I slipped it into my pocket and promised myself I'd keep looking carefully, even if I never found an answer. Because I was starting to understand something, sometimes the search is as important as the discovery. And the people who keep searching even when the ground stays quiet are the ones who keep history alive. If you're ready, I can give you part 8, which will serve as the final act where the boy narrator weaves together the science, the people, and the possibilities, leaving the viewer with a sense of wonder rather than a fixed answer. On the train back from northern Greece, I kept the pebble in my pocket, rolling it between my fingers. It was small and light, but it felt heavier than it should, maybe because of what it reminded me of. It wasn't a fossil. It didn't prove anything about Ouranopithecus. but it came from the same layers that might still be hiding the answers. I kept thinking about the dig team. They were still there now, hunched over in the sun, brushing away dust, chasing something they might never catch. When I got home, I spread out my notes, drawings, and maps on the floor. The Africa map, dense with finds. The Europe map, scattered and faint, with the name Ouranopithecus written in a looping circle. And in the middle, between the two, the in-between lands Anatolia, the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean. The bridge that could have carried an ancient ape southward. It was like a puzzle where most of the pieces were missing, and the few we had didn't quite lock together. I realized something then. All along, I had been looking for an answer. Yes or no? Was Ouranopithecus the first human ancestor? But maybe the real story wasn't about the answer. Maybe it was about the space where the answer should be and what we do inside that space. That space is where scientists dig. It's where arguments happen, where new questions grow. It's where patience lives. I thought about what Dr. Papadopoulos had said, that Ouranopithecus might survive as part of our family tree, or it might not, but either way, the debate would make us look in places we'd never looked before. I thought about Dr. Richardson in Africa, convinced the evidence was already clear, and yet still out there in the field every day, hunting for more. I thought about Professor Corellis, who had chased a single ghost ape for decades without letting go. And Andreas and Eleni, sifting the dirt grain by grain, not because they knew they would find something, but because they might. When I was younger, I used to think history was a list of things we knew. Dates, events, names. Now I saw it differently. History is also made of things we don't know yet. And the deep past, the millions of years ago past, is almost nothing but that. I looked again at my two maps. On the Africa side, the names felt familiar now: Australopithecus afarensis, Paranthropus, Homo habilis. The big chapters in the human story. On the Europe side, there were fewer names: Ouranopithecus, Grycopithecus. They were whispers, not shouts. But whispers can be important. They can make you turn your head in a new direction. If Ouranopithecus really was the first ancestor, it would mean our story began on hills like the ones I'd just walked, under skies that smelled of sea and dust. It would mean the first steps toward humanity might have happened on a continent where I had eaten olives for lunch and heard goats bleating in the distance. And if not, if it was just a cousin who didn't lead to us, then it was still part of the great, branching tree of primates, one of the many experiments nature tried before arriving at us. Either way, the hills would still hold their secrets. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the moment Eleni had found the molar. That spark. It wasn't about what they had found, it was about the fact that they had found something at all. That feeling of connection, across millions of years, from a living hand to the tooth of a long-dead animal. That, I thought, was the real reason people kept coming back. Not just for answers, but for that spark. In the morning, I put the pebble from Corellis on my desk, next to my notebooks. It looked so ordinary. If someone else saw it, they'd probably think it came from a garden path. But I knew where it came from. And I knew what it meant to me, a reminder that there's more under the surface than we think. I still don't know if Ouranopithecus was the first human ancestor. I'm not sure anyone ever will, not completely. But I know this: the search for that answer has made people cross continents, argue across conference tables, and spend their lives in dusty fields. And maybe that's the real story, not the final answer, but the journey of questions that keeps going, one shovel of dirt at a time. Someday, maybe, someone will find the fossil that changes the argument forever. It could happen tomorrow, or in 50 years, or never. But when they do, if they do, it will be because of all the days that came before, all the people who kept digging when the ground seemed empty, all the maps that had empty spaces on them. Until then, Ouranopithecus will remain what it has been for decades, a shadow on the edge of our family tree, just far enough away to keep us wondering, just close enough to make us hope. And I think that's a good place for it to be. Because sometimes, it's the questions we can't answer that keep our curiosity alive. And curiosity, I've learned, is what drives us forward, whether we're chasing an ape in the Greek hills, or just trying to understand who we really are.